Hi, everybody. Give folks one last minute to grab their beer or cheese, or beer and cheese. All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to New America, and thank you for coming. You are here for tonight's event, and hopefully you're tuning in online to watch tonight's event. Why should we imagine solar flares taking down international space stations? Which, despite its weirdly specific title, is going to be a wide-ranging conversation on science and science fiction and art and Afrofuturism and astrophysics and alien life and the future of the internet, postcolonialism here on Earth, and the colonization of Mars. So, I'm Kevin Bankston. I'm the director of the Open Technology Institute, which is the tech and tech policy development wing here at New America. I'm also a big sci-fi fan, which is one of the reasons why I'm excited to be here tonight at this event sponsored by Future Tense. Future Tense, if you don't already know it, is a partnership between New America, Arizona State University, and Slate magazine, which explores emerging technologies and their transformative effects on society and public policy. Central to that partnership is a series of events in New York and Washington, D.C., including events like this one, as well as the Future Tense channel on Slate. And so you can follow the conversation here tonight with hashtag #AfterTheFlare, and you can follow Future Tense on Twitter at FutureTenseNow. So without further ado, I would love to introduce our guests for the evening. First, Deji Olukotun. He is the author of the novel Nigerians in Space and its new sci-fi sequel, After the Flare, the inciting incident of which is also the title of this event tonight. A solar flare takes out the ISS and a whole lot of other things besides. He's a fellow at Future Tense. He is the new head of social impact at Sonos. And until recently, he worked on the advocacy team of the digital human rights organization Access Now, a team I often had the pleasure, and still often do, have the pleasure of working with. Also joining us is Lucianne Walkowicz. She is currently, this year, for the next year, the Baruch S. Bloomberg NASA/Library of Congress Chair in Astrobiology in the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress, where she is, amongst other things, examining the ethics of Mars colonization. She is also astronomer at the Adler Planetarium in Chicago, where she studies stellar magnetic activity, like flares, and their influence on planetary habitability using data from NASA's Kepler mission. She's also a practicing artist working in a variety of media from oil paint to sound. You can find information about her work as a scientist and as an artist at tangledfields.com, including a link to a piece she wrote for Vox just last year about how about the damage that a solar flare could cause to the power grid and to the internet. So I'm going to ask her a question about that right after these housekeeping points. Please silence your cell phones. During Q&A, which we will get to in about 45 minutes, please wait for the microphone to ask your questions so the people online can hear you. And please ask your questions in the form of a question. And please, we welcome you to stick around after the event for our reception, where we will continue with book sales, and Deji will be around to sign copies of the book, if you like. And we will continue to serve beer and wine and cheese. So, Lucianne, tell us a bit more about what are solar flares and what risk do they pose, and what was the Carrington event, and what happens if another one happens? Can you tell us about that?
During the Q&A, are people also allowed to ask for questions?
One question. One question at a time.
Just giving you a hard time. So solar flares are these really energetic events that launch themselves off the surface of the sun. So our sun is magnetic and has these sort of tangly magnetic fields on its surface that trap like really hot particles and plasma. And sometimes those fields have tension, and so they snap, they rearrange, and that can spew these particles, literally particles of the sun, out into space towards us. And they also are associated with like big bursts of energy. So normally the light from the sun is mostly in the visible range where our eyes can see it, and a little bit in the X-rays and ultraviolet light, more energetic kinds of light. But during flares, we get these big bursts of X-rays and ultraviolet radiation. And so that creates all kinds of effects here on Earth. Most often, it just creates aurora. So the northern lights are the glowing of our own atmosphere as those particles interact from the sun. So most of the time, it's totally benign. But occasionally, we get these really big flares. And the Carrington event, which you mentioned, is this historical flare from 1859 that is named after a astronomer who was minding his own business, observing the sun and drawing, so don't look at the sun, but you can project it and draw the sunspots. And that's a very old form of astronomy. Lots of different cultures have had that, observations of sunspots throughout history. And he was watching the sun and saw this brightening, and what he had witnessed was this incredibly energetic burst of energy and particles that then created auroras that were so strong they came all the way down. They were seen in the Caribbean. They woke up campers in the Rocky Mountains. Usually, you have to go up north or very far south to see northern or southern lights. But this was something that created a really global effect. It also shorted out telegraphs, which were the dominant technology at the time. And so we looked at this event now as a much more technologically capable, but also technologically reliant society that has all kinds of things that use the power grid. And it's a little bit of a worry that if we had another big event like that, that it could create damage to our technological infrastructure. And so that's why flares are cool, and also why flares are dangerous. Like most cool things, they're kind of dangerous.
So it screwed with the telegraph 150 years ago. Today it would screw with the internet, it would screw with the electrical grid.
And also satellites. We didn't have anything in space in 1859. And today, your ability to use your phone to map the New America Institute and come to this event relies on things like GPS, and all of our communications rely on satellites. And they're out there in space where they're relatively unshielded from bombardments of solar particles.
And this is not a out there possibility. In fact, if I'm remembering from reading your article correctly, just a few years ago there was a Carrington level event that we just missed by a week. If we'd just been a little week earlier or later in our orbit, we would have gotten this huge flare just a few years ago, right?
Yeah, so this is a sort of a subtlety that actually works out in our favor, is that these events happen on part of the surface of the sun. So the whole sun itself doesn't send energy equally in every direction. It's sort of, like throwing a baseball. It goes in one direction and has a particular trajectory or path. And so for us here on Earth, we're going around the sun, and that means that sometimes these events just miss us. And fortunately, we have lots of space telescopes that are designed to actually observe the sun and watch for those events taking place. So usually we only get about 8.5 minutes between the light arriving from the sun, but particles move a little bit slower, so we have usually a little bit of warning before they arrive.
So insurers are pretty woke about climate change because they need to factor that into their thinking about risk. It turns out they're looking at solar flares as well. There was a Lloyd's of London report that indicated how severe this could be. What did that report say?
Yeah, so there's actually been a number of different reports. So it's not only insurers, it's also the US government and other governments look into this as a source of national security, right? And so a lot of those reports do different kinds of estimates on the kind of damage that could result. One of the things about our power grid is that it's very interconnected. And so failures in part of the power grid can take down very large swaths of the rest of it. And sometimes if it's a minor event, it does the equivalent of tripping a breaker in your house, and you just repair the damage and move on. But if it melts down a transformer, well, transformers cost millions of dollars and take a year to manufacture. So depending on how severe it is, you have a greater or lesser chance. So there's a number of different reports that go from like a mild gasp to complete pearl clutching about how bad a potential flare would be, but all of them essentially say not good.
But one could imagine something like, say, looking at what happened to the power grid in Puerto Rico from a hurricane, but seeing that on perhaps a continental scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, the dire situation in Puerto Rico should remind us of how much we depend on energy. And so there are milder examples. So back in like I think it was 2003, it might have also been the 1989 flare, but there was a flare that essentially disabled part of the grid in the Northeast, predominantly affected Quebec, but also a little bit of the northeastern United States. And that was a situation where the power was down for like 24 hours. And so, you know, the damage there was relatively minor, but if you have something that was the level of a Carrington event, you could be looking at, you know, big swaths of the continent being totally out.
And the electromagnetic field provides some protection, but not for our satellites.
Yes.
Or for our International Space Station, which answers the question of the panel, why should we imagine solar flares taking out the International Space Station? But Deji, why did you imagine that? You read some of these same reports, you did some research, and you came up with a science fiction scenario around this science. Tell us why.
Yeah, well, it is actually somewhat of a trope in science fiction, the solar flare, but I think there was a new current of the conversation that bubbled up when Lucianne was going on radio and writing her articles. So I think I happened to catch some of that. I was looking for a scenario that could shift the focus from, you know, when you watch your typical science fiction movie, the plot happens, the aliens always attack the United States, and the resolution is in the United States, and if it's not in the United States, it's resolved by the US Air Force or Army or some actor in the United States. So I wanted to use it as a way to shift global power and have us look at what might happen if instead some parts of the world are taken offline through an event like this and others are thriving. And in this case, it's Nigeria and West Africa. So, you know, but I was at the Milwaukee airport about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I stopped and I picked up a random collection of books, this series called Tom Swift, which was put out in the 20s and 30s, and then again in I think the 50s and 60s. The first one I opened up was about a solar flare. So that was really interesting, because here I had done all this research, and I really wish I had had that 2-minute explanation that you just gave, because that would have saved me a lot of time. But yeah, so it was really a chance to think about not just, you know, right now I feel like our access and knowledge about what NASA's doing is greater than ever. You can go online and watch live feeds from the space station. But then what would happen if some of these things that we take for granted, all the advanced technologies that we're enjoying, disappeared? And it's a scenario that can be very interesting. You know, in the book, Nigeria stays online. So a lot
and that's because it's on the equator where the...
Well, this is the part where I'd love to hear Lucianne's thoughts. Because what I saw was a diagram in the Lloyd's report. If I'm not mistaken, there was a diagram that said the magnetic field would sort of shield the equator. And you did write about that a little bit in your article, like Cuba, you know, there were some particles seen as close as Cuba. I mean, some northern lights kind of effects. So the idea was that it might be possible. It could happen. And then what would happen with all the technology and all the resources flooded to a region that people typically think of as developing, that it still has a lot of catching up to do. So what would happen if Nigeria could leapfrog and contribute in that way?
Well, one of the things that happened is a reversal of a current political situation where you had a bunch of Americans fleeing to Mexico and Central America. Can you talk a little bit more about before we move on to Africa, what was the socio-political situation you sketch in the US after this disaster?
Yeah, so I think there has been a lot of great thought about And I think a lot of it depends on your own personal take on the way humans behave. Do you think we would tear each other apart? Would we, there are the preppers, which are communities that prepare for sort of apocalyptic scenarios. They hoard food, wall off their properties, build silos, several stories into the ground, all in preparation for either some religious event or... So, I thought, but there are a lot of people who probably would band together and support each other. So, in my view, the military would probably still be functioning in some way. So that would be a haven. People with generators would thrive for a while if they weren't shorted out by the flare. So I sort of saw it as enclaves. Silicon Valley becomes an enclave, which has its own exploration.
Very exclusive one. Right?
Very exclusive.
Yes.
You have to pay to get in. You pay to play, and to arrive, you need a permit. And so that's part of it. People who are more communitarian end up in the southwest of the United States. And then on the East Coast, people wall themselves off and put up big barriers and hire private security. So I felt like there would be a blend of these things, because you see those blends today. There are people who throw up huge walls and hide, and then there are other people who keep their doors unlocked and open for other, and share with others.
So Lucianne, what is the likelihood or possibility of an event on the scale of what Deji sketches? How possible is that, and how long would it take us to recover from an event like that?
Yeah, so actually a lot of what we learn about from, let me lead with the good news. It's relatively rare. One of the things that's difficult about studying rare events is that we only have like the Carrington event, essentially, as one of our observed events on the sun. And so it can be really difficult to describe like how frequently those things happen. But this is actually a strength of studying other stars. So instead of waiting for our sun to fry us periodically and then counting how often that happens, we can actually observe other stars and see how often they're flaring and then calculate the probability of that. So that's something that became possible with NASA's Kepler mission a couple of years ago, which was a mission that was a space telescope designed to look for planets around other stars. But it actually was really great at studying stars as well. And the estimates from observing stars like the sun with Kepler are that these events happen like every few hundred years. So that means somewhere between, like 200-ish to 300-ish. They're not periodic. They're chaotic, essentially. And so that doesn't mean that we can be like, well, 1859 was, roughly 150 years ago. We can't time it or predict it in that way. In fact, flares are really difficult to predict in general. But we can say that probably we will have another event like that in our life. Maybe not our lifetimes, but within the near horizon of the human race. And so I think that the chances are pretty good. It's just kind of a matter of when.
Yeah. Wow. So start saving your money to buy your way into the Silicon Valley enclave. But moving to Nigeria, part of the story engine here is the ISS is in a degrading orbit, and it's going to scorch India, and there's someone still up there too. And so Nigeria's space program becomes the center of the rescue effort, and this is set in and around the spaceport where they are preparing to do this mission. Why Nigeria, other than you being a Nigerian American, and why a Nigerian space program? Can you talk a little bit? I mean, apparently there is one, and could you talk a bit about that?
Sure, yeah. I had the opportunity to visit the space program in 2014, and yeah, it exists. It's a real thing, and they have a mission to put a person into space by 2030. Other countries also have one. Ghana has a space program, Ethiopia has a space program, and then other developing countries like Malaysia and United Arab Emirates has a pretty ambitious program that this center featured a conversation about. So I think part of it is that countries, the most compelling argument that I heard was from the founder of Nigeria's space program. His name is Turner Isun. And he said that, people wonder when you have poverty, extreme poverty, you have problems with basic potable water, why would you have a space program? He said, well, it helps us shift our solution space, that sometimes the really advanced technology can help us think about our own country in different ways. Look at floodplains, try to protect farmers, help them predict crop yields, do population census. So there are practical values for it. And I think I was really moved by that, that visit to the program in 2014, both seeing the potential of it, but then also the very real problems it has, which is lack of funding. Most of the funding goes towards satellites, communication satellites, and then developing countries actually do really cool partnerships with other countries, and they share the satellite time. It's a way for them to distribute the costs of launching the satellite and using the data. So that was the idea, is that there actually is one there, and if it was the only one that was still in operation, then the world would shift its resources. And the reason, why would anyone care? The reason in the story is that there's an astronaut who's stranded up on the space station, and that needs to be rescued. So people just pool their resources. And I bring in India because India actually has a very advanced space program. They've sent a rover to Mars. And India prides itself on running the most cost-efficient space program. So there are kind of interesting cultural dynamics. The different space programs try to distinguish themselves in different ways. Japan has one. There's a lot of space programs. So that just kind of feeds into the plot.
Yeah. Well, and so you mentioned struggles with potable water while also struggling to launch people into space. Like, one of the things that struck me about the book and strikes me about Nigeria, and you've written about this outside of the context of the book, are the striking contrasts between old and new, between technical and natural. Can you talk a little bit more about that contrast or tension and how it impacted your work? I mean, one way it seemed to obviously impact the work is in terms of some of the technology you described. This is in the near future. And so you have these biomimicking cell phones, these gecko phones that behave like animals. You have these mal flies that are actually like little robotic fly drones that are trying to infect the gecko phones. There's a great technology of you take the cowrie, which are these shells that have been used as currency, for hundreds of years, and then integrate them with the blockchain. So there are a lot of great examples of these dichotomies being joined in the context of the tech in your book, but talk more about that.
Sure, yeah. I think, with the prominence of Silicon Valley and all the amazing innovations that's happening, a lot of people feel that they're just trying to catch up, and that feeling also goes to things like jobs, that their jobs can be taken away by a robot. But in other countries, they want to create opportunities for their own people. So what would happen in the way this, with the flare, sets it up so that there is the time and space for Nigeria to innovate on its own and mingle the technology with its traditions. The biomimicry of these kind of animals that are mingled with devices, the idea there is, in my father's ethnic group, the Yoruba, there are a lot of proverbs involving animals. And because of the history of the culture, it was sort of in the forest. And so I was playing with those ideas that it is a stereotype, wild exotic animals of Africa, but at the same time it is deeply in the lore and understanding of some cultures. So I wanted to see that. And then in the story I also contrast that sort of phones mimicking animal behavior with the actual hacking of live animals. And so there's some play on that and what the ethics are behind that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You also, one of the interesting sort of fusion technologies is the use of online identities fused with tribal identity. Tribal identity plays a large role in Nigeria. Tell me a little bit more about that concept.
Sure.
And why you integrated that.
Yeah, and I feel like I should just say, Nigeria is in West Africa. It's the biggest, it's the most populous country in Africa. It's not the biggest by land mass. It's also the wealthiest country in Africa. So just to bring people back who are like, what is Nigeria? If you haven't already Googled it on your phone. Sorry, can you repeat that last question?
I was asking about the role of tribal identity.
Okay, yes. So there are over 250 ethnic groups in Nigeria. And there is actually a lot of ethnic harmony, especially in cities where people have to get along, and they do, and they have for hundreds of years. But then there are times where if you're the wrong tribe in the wrong place at the wrong time, you can be killed just for the way you look. So that was based somewhat from my activism work of, there was not too long ago, Facebook required transgender people to share their real name, and I'm not sure, you might have been involved in that campaign yourself.
We were not particularly active.
You weren't
on
in
that
the,
issue,
okay.
But yeah.
But Kevin, for your work at EFF and so on.
Yeah.
So Access Now campaigned a little bit with other groups on that to try to get Facebook to say, some people can't use the real name because they'll get killed or ostracized or harmed or lose their job. And my idea of bringing this tribal identity is just in Nigeria, the thought is, well, if you're in the wrong ethnic group at the wrong time, that can get you in trouble. But I merged it a little bit so that if you have, you could shift your tribal identity and your actual gestures and behavior changes to the person on the other end. And then it has an added security layer that you can access certain parts of the spaceport network depending on the tribal identity that you've assumed at that time. So it's just kind of playing with some of the real code switching that actually happens every day for a lot of people. When you read about Africa, you say this person's from this tribe, that person's from this tribe. In reality, a lot of people are actually from multiple tribes. Even, I said my father's from Yoruba. He's also half Evi from Togo, which is a different group. And that's a common story in Africa, that people have multiple identities that they swap at different times to their advantage.
Another echo of an area where our organizations work in the book is the balkanization or the splintering of the internet. After the flare, especially, that accelerates countries locking down their internets, and in fact, Nigeria has its own, I forget what it was called.
NigerWeb.
NigerWeb.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit more about that trend and how that played into the thinking of the future world in your book?
Yeah, definitely. I was happy to see that Lucianne had talked about that, how the internet would be impacted by the electricity outage, which is something that we forget. I think I experienced that when I was writing the first book, Nigerians in Space, because in South Africa at that time, they were rolling blackouts. So internet would go down, electricity would come back up, and then the internet would eventually come back up. And just that feeling that they were connected. But yeah, I worked on a campaign called Keep It On, which was fighting when governments intentionally shut down the internet. It was 156 organizations, 130 organizations from 56 countries. The campaign's still running.
Hashtag Keep It On.
Hashtag Keep It On. And it's because governments want to assert control over people's self-expression and control the information they have. So what would happen, in the book I'm asking the question, what would happen if everyone's afraid and suddenly the resources aren't there? Would it be like you're just throwing up digital tariffs, and just to get from one part of the internet to the next, you need special permissions, you need to be from the country? That is actually the vision that a lot of countries have for us. So, and that argument is being made even today. So I just looked at that, and you can see that Nigeria isn't innocent there because they wall off their internet. They don't want other people on, and their excuse is that they're preventing malware and cyber criminals.
Yeah, which is often a justification you see for regimes that are then also instituting massive censorship and surveillance. We're going to come back to you soon, I promise. But I wanted to ask about Afrofuturism. This is a word that's going around a lot these days in the discourse around science fiction and race. What is it? Is your book Afrofuturism? And how should we be thinking about that issue and the representation of people of color in science fiction?
Yeah, so...
Nice, narrow, easy question.
Yeah, Afrofuturism is a big topic. I know that's been discussed here. It was a term that was invented by an academic to kind of like encompass different strains of thought, creativity in predominantly African-American music, literature, and movies and writing. I think, for me, distilling it down, what I really love about it, and it's been going on since the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. It's been going on for a long time. And it's just become cool for some reason that's beyond me. I'm not sure why people are really interested in it right now. But I'm happy to have the label applied to the book. That's not why I wrote it. I did explore technology African futures and African American futures, because the protagonist is African American. He's not Nigerian man. And for me, when I distill it, what I like about Afrofuturism, what I find that is very liberating for people, is that it's the philosophy that we all have the right to imagine our own futures and to imagine a better future for ourselves. If your imagination is crushed and you can't even think of what would make a better life for you and your family or your society or your community, then you're going to have a hard time getting there. And I think that's the fundamentally freeing part about Afrofuturism, that doesn't have to be limited to African Americans. It's just a way that African Americans have used this technique and this philosophy to try to imagine their own stories and better stories for themselves. And Itasha Womack, who's really an expert on that, is going to be here in just a couple of weeks to talk more about, next week, to talk about it. She's really, follow her on Twitter, she's excellent. She's the most positive person you'll ever follow on Twitter.
Yes, another Future Tense event coming up next week, the history of the future, hashtag. So, and you know, one thing that keeps coming up in the context of Afrofuturism now is the Black Panther, the comic, and Ta-Nehisi Coates doing the comic, and now we've seen the trailers of this vast secret technological civilization hidden in the jungle in Africa. I don't want to give away too much, but there are some hints of a lost civilization subplot in this book as well. Do you see any sort of creative link there, or a theme there? Or?
You know, it's funny. There isn't a direct link because I didn't know the Black Panther story that well until I was almost finished with the book.
Oh, okay.
When Ta-Nehisi Coates made it much more prominent. I actually went back and started reading the earlier iterations of the Black Panther. And I've said in other places what I love about it is it's encouraging people to explore their imaginations and their own histories. There are problems with it from an African standpoint, which is that at least in the comics, the dress is wrong. Some of the cultural things are wrong. They're almost like stereotypes of how Africans are expected to behave. I mean, it was started, in the '60s, so there's plenty of reasons.
Co-created by Stan Lee.
Exactly.
He
didn't grow up in Uganda, where it's supposed to be set. But I think what I want to do with Nigeria is a lot of African cultures may have a very rich oral history and a lot of cultural knowledge, but the archaeology hasn't really happened. So in Nigeria, there are a few archaeological mysteries of people who have been around, civilizations that have been and disappeared. And that happens all over the continent. So I just looked into some of those mysteries and put that in the story. Some of these things, archaeologists have done a great job. I mean, they know a lot about what's going on, but there's still enough for us to have some fun with the story. So I think that's kind of the similarity to Wakanda and the Black Panther story.
So on the less fun tip, Boko Haram plays a large role in the book. Can you discuss that a bit and what role they play?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but many of you may be familiar with the Bring Back Our Girls campaign, which is when 300 girls were stolen from their school in the middle of the night and forced to go with this militant Islamic group. So that's a reality. They still exist. They're out there in Nigeria. Some of those girls have been recovered, but a lot of scholarship has shown that, or recent coverage has shown that story is actually way more complicated than we'd like it to be. For example, some of the women who are rescued don't want to be rescued because they actually have a better life with the militants than they did before. But they are still extremely violent. They force people to blow themselves up in marketplaces. They do beheadings, all of the really horrible, reprehensible stuff that you hear about militants anywhere. So that's just a reality. It is part of Nigeria, especially in areas that haven't received as much government support. So the infrastructure isn't there, the education isn't there, and there are all kinds of contradictions that feeds into the story. So there's a country that wants to try to go up to space and rescue someone from the space station, but at the same time, there are people rampaging in the countryside on a completely different quest.
So in a really awkward segue, we're going to move from post-colonial terrorist politics of Nigeria, where Boko Haram is in many ways reacting to British colonialism and rejecting Western education and culture, to the colonization of Mars. Because that is a topic that is the focus of your tenure at the Library of Congress. And I'd love to hear more about that work and the ethics of extraplanetary colonization.
Yeah, I always think the word post-colonialism is funny because if you ever want to see colonialism alive and well, just watch some of the ways we talk about going to other planets. You know, right now we're at this interesting juncture where we have the technological capability to go to places like Mars, to send not only rovers, but in the very near future to send human beings. But a lot of the way that we talk about it is dominated by the monoculture of who are the creators of science and technology in general, by which I mean the Silicon Territories, as they're called in your book. So, you know, a lot of the narratives about going to space and humanity's future in space is very much coming out of marketing departments at private spaceflight companies who are interested in being players in space in the same way that, you know, usually it's been governments sending people to space, like organizations here in the US like NASA. So, you know, it's surprising to me that when we talk about something that is as futuristic as human beings being on another planet and either going and visiting or staying, that we still recycle things like Columbus coming to America as though that has no attached baggage to it and was like a totally like, fine thing. So, you know, when we talk about space, one of the things that I'm really interested in is looking at not only how we talk about it and how using those narratives excludes people from imagining their futures in space. You know, I think if you constantly recycle these like colonialist narratives that in their implementation really excluded a lot of people and actually resulted in the exploitation of many, many people, not only indigenous Americans, but also people who were taken forcibly away from Africa and into slavery. You know, you repeat a lot of the mistakes of the past and you cut that imagining of who can be on another planet, you cut that off from a lot of people. So I'm looking partially at narratives, but I'm also looking at the laws around who can, for example, own things in space. So we have this Outer Space Treaty that's from 1967 that states that no one can own a celestial body. But just a couple of years ago, in 2015, the United States passed a law that says that you can actually own space resources. So you can't own Mars, but if, for example, you found water on Mars, well, then you could own that water. So it's not totally clear how a lot of these laws interact with each other. You know, what does it mean, practically speaking, to own water but not actually own the land that you're on? Well, we have analogies of that, right? You know, in the past couple of years, we've seen the protests over the Dakota Access Pipeline, where you have indigenous people with a right to the land and companies wanting to bring, you know, construct essentially infrastructure on that land and bring resources through it or from it in a way that impacts it. As a person who studies the science essentially of life in the universe, I'm very interested in seeing us learn some of the things that Mars can teach us from an astrobiological standpoint. It's one of the easiest places for us to get to. It's a place where we might learn whether there was an independent origin of life, whether life, if it originated on Mars, evolved independently, whether there are similarities or differences. And so from that point of view, you know, we don't let people go mine in places that are of cultural or scientific significance here on Earth necessarily. And so, you know, I think a lot of the sort of, if you follow those threads off into the future of the plans that are being made now and the way we talk about those plans, they have implications that might mean that we don't get to learn whether there's life on another planet in our solar system. So they have very serious scientific implications. And they also, and this is one of the things that I love about Afrofuturism too, is that the things that we think about our future in space very much reflect the kinds of things that we think are permissible here on Earth, for better and worse. And so, that can be imagining like a future in which people who normally don't get to be a major voice get their voice, or it can be a future in which we set ourselves up for exploitation yet again. And so I'm using the collections in the library to look into some of those issues.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up? Does Antarctica provide us with any sort of sense of how this might play out? It's supposed to be kind of international territory. I have no idea whether you've been to Antarctica or whether you're even the appropriate person. But like, I've been thinking, that, maybe it provides some insight into how we might behave. And
yeah, I would say that Antarctica presents one vision of how Mars exploration could take place. So work in Antarctica is typically, it has similarities in that it's very removed from the rest of the Earth, and also differences in that it's a much nicer place to be than Mars. So, when we look at Antarctica, most of the work there is scientific. So there's not, for example, a huge amount of like resource extraction happening at McMurdo base there. And so that's sort of one vision of how we might see ourselves on Mars, but also we have to be a lot less careful there too. The things that are negatively impacting Antarctica tend to be global things like climate change, and not so much human contamination, because it's already part of the Earth's biosphere. So there are similarities, but also differences.
So it's funny you mentioned Antarctica for a reason I'll get to in about 60 seconds. Because we talked about this in the green room. Kim Stanley Robinson, science fiction author, he wrote a really incredible trilogy about the colonization of Mars: Red Mars, Blue Mars, Green Mars, tracking the changing color of the planet as it is terraformed. And one of the major themes and discussions in the book is the ethics of what they are doing, the ethics of even going there, how they're impacting the environment, how they can or should react if they find evidence of life, past or present. It's a really powerful piece of work, and possibly my very favorite sci-fi ever. But then he followed it up with a book called Antarctica, basically using that as a microcosm for the exact same debates, and is I highly recommend it, and I think it addresses many of the same issues you're studying right now. Kim Stanley Robinson is also a good example of another theme in science fiction right now called cli-fi, which is trying to imagine what the future looks like in the face of the reality of massive climate change. And he just had a book come out called New York 2140, which is actually a somewhat hopeful vision of what New York looks like in 2140 after several massive surges of water rise, such that lower Manhattan is basically a new Venice. And I'm seeing this trend of people trying to grapple with how do we imagine our future in a constructive way in the face of this massive change that is coming. Even the Trump administration's new climate report agrees. This seems to me an example of what you call science fiction thinking. You wrote about the idea of applying applied science fiction, like science fiction as a tool for thinking about the future in a systematic way. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, along the same lines as the empowering nature of Afrofuturism and thinking through to imagine your own future, I think there are tools, I mean, even just before you get to the science fiction, just fiction writing, learning to write a story, coming up with characters and plot, and I think what even a literary fiction writer will do some world building, and in that sense, figure out the town that the story is set in, or the cafe where a scene's going to happen, and what sits where and why, and how do these things interact, who walks into the room. I think science fiction takes it maybe a little bit further because it removes some of those basic assumptions about how gravity works, or how a particular new kind of biology might fit into the scenario. And I think I did an event with Nora Jameson, who's just won the Hugo Award twice, which has only happened with one other author, two back-to-back, which was Orson Scott Card. And her world building.
There's an irony there, I think.
Oh, yeah.
No, in terms of Orson Scott Card is a renowned.
Yeah, kind of.
Kind of.
Yeah.
I want to say kind of racist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Nora is
yeah.
like the woman of color who just got 2 Hugos in a row.
Yeah,
and,
yeah. And she's excellent world building to the extent, in her story, the special power that some of the characters have is they can sort of terraform themselves. And like their version of the Force is like being able to understand complex geological processes and manipulate them. And that has to have a certain logic. So in building that world so that it's consistent and it makes sense, and what would the political structures, that's world building. She's a little bit more in a different time frame, but what I believe is that tool of trying to imagine a new scenario and all the complex forces at play, the people who would be acting upon them and who would be reacting, can be very helpful for imagining new technologies, thinking about new technologies, and even things, as you've observed, Kevin's written some great stuff on this. Companies are thinking about it, about how they imagine how they should evolve their products and so forth. So I think it's got a lot of application, but I do feel that, like design thinking, the principles of design, designing a room, designing a space, designing an object, it's another tool for you to find creativity in your life and try to set your goals and achieve great things if you can. So I really think that science fiction thinking it's actually pretty new to me. So I say this as someone who's written my first science fiction book. I've written a bunch of science fiction stories, but before that I was really a literary writer. So I see the power of it and why it's fun and enjoyable, and I think other people should be able to tap into that.
Public service announcement. Specifically, we were talking about N.K. Jemison's 5th season, which is brilliant. Highly recommend it. So we're seeing science fiction being used more and more. You mentioned in the company setting, in the think tank setting as a sort of strategic foresight tool, sometimes even impacting policy. There's also an interplay between fiction and art and science, and I'd like to turn to you as an artist and hear more about your view on that relationship, and in particular the relationship between your work as a scientist and your work as an artist.
Sure, yeah. I think that that certainly art has a little bit of similarity to this way in which science fiction thinking can be used, in that it can take us away from what so often happens in science, where you get this very, not even necessarily a dry explanation, but a very thorough explanation of how something works. That's one way of experiencing scientific discovery and knowledge. It's the kind of thing that you might, see like on a plaque at the planetarium, for example. But there are other experiences that I personally have as a scientist that I think are not represented in the way that people who are not scientists consume science. So to make that a little less vague, one of the things that I think is most interesting as part of the process of doing research is the moments before you know what's going on. Those moments where you're like, I think I see some sort of pattern here, but I'm not really sure what it means yet. That like opening of a door down a sort of curious path that you can have. And if you're not a practicing scientist, that doesn't happen for you with science very often, because there's always somebody kind of telling you already what it means. But the fun of being a scientist is that the universe doesn't come with an explanatory plaque. So in some of the work that I've done, so first of all, I'll put the caveat out there that not all of my artwork, in fact, most of my artwork has absolutely nothing to do with science, but some of it does. And so, for example, I did this project using data from NASA's Kepler mission, where what Kepler did was it measured how bright stars are with time, and stars actually spin on their axes like tops. So sometimes there are periodic changes in brightness, and you can map those from changes in light to pitch in sound. So you can map it to different frequencies that your ear can hear. So I used this to create a sound installation where you could actually listen to the frequencies of those stars change with time. And what I was trying to do was to give people access to that primary experience of hearing that there was a pattern and that there was structure in that data, rather than just showing people a bunch of graphs where they'd be like, there's a bunch of graphs. And I feel like graphs are also inherently inaccessible sometimes.
This is totally reminding me, not trying to pimp my Twitter feed, but it's there from Halloween. NASA actually released basically an entire song, track, what do you call it, playlist of tracks of noise drawn from, it's like the spooky sounds of space, but it's various types of space data turned into oral, input, and it was really spooky and interesting. Yeah. Is that 10 minutes for us or for everything? Everything. Okay, then we're going to move to questions right now. Okay, and so again, wait for the mic. Raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and the mic will come to you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Alan Herbert. I work for a company that sends payloads to the International Space Station, so we don't want anything to happen to it now. But my question is to you about the moon. I know Mars is kind of far out, but I was just at a thing yesterday where they talked about who owns the moon, talk about the same thing you were talking about, and there's resources on the moon right now too, and people are talking about putting up developments, all kinds of, this is real, all kinds of different things on the moon, which is only 4 days away. So I know we're talking about Mars, but what do you say about the moon, which could even happen sooner, because the Trump administration is saying we're going to the moon right now, and then we'll look at Mars later on, but there's so many companies, private companies, looking at things on the moon and saying, how do we monetize certain things? How do you assure certain things? And a lot of companies want to own certain things, but one of the things they were saying is that if you own a habitat or something, you own that, but you don't own the ground. So there's all kinds of different things. So my question is, what about the moon? What have you learned about the moon in terms of ethics and how we're going to deal with that? Because that's really could happen in 10 years.
And I'll also add, and what about asteroids as well? Because that's where a lot of the speculation is.
Yeah, so the moon is just as complicated and a place for totally different reasons. So a thing that makes the moon and Mars distinct is that Mars was probably what we call habitable, or at least a hospitable environment for life to have formed at some point in its history. The moon, on the other hand, we don't believe to ever have been capable of hosting life. So in that sense, the difference of that you could actually still find like existing life on Mars today or a history of life kind of gets taken out from the standpoint of worrying about the moon. However, you're right that the moon is a big focus for this administration. I actually just wrote an op-ed for Scientific American sort of bemoaning that we pivot like every 4 to 8 years. We're like pivoting to the moon. No, we're pivoting to Mars. No, we're pivoting in a circle. So, in the case of the moon, we do have these resources. For example, the moon is a great source of helium, which has a variety of different engineering, aside from your party balloons, a variety of different important engineering applications. And there is talk of going and mining or selling real estate. And it is complicated. It's not, you literally definitely cannot own the moon, at least at the moment. And that's something that almost every existing country agreed to back in the 60s. But you do have these other pieces of legislation, like the Space Act, which was not from this administration. It was the previous one that says that you can own these resources. And so it's not clear how that plays out in practice. There's also cultural arguments to be made, so Neil Armstrong's footprints on the moon are now arguably a very important human cultural site. It's very rare that the history of exploration of a space is actually literally imprinted in the soil of the space and hasn't been, the moon doesn't have an atmosphere, it doesn't have a water cycle, so it's the total history of that exploration is preserved. And so, do we even own Neil Armstrong's footprints? Can anybody go do anything to them? And so I'm literally reading a book right now that is called Who Owns the Moon? But there's a tendency to think that if it's not Mars, if it's the moon, that we're like totally free to just kind of like do whatever, and that is also not the case.
Yeah, just my relationship to the moon is just that my first book, Nigerians in Space, the main character is a lunar geologist, but not from the standpoint of exploiting the resources of the moon. It's just what drives him, and it's his passion. And Johnson Space Laboratory in Houston.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Questions? Yes, sir. Wait for the mic. Sorry.
Hi, Jack Krapansky, independent. There was some mention of the Discover satellite. And since we're talking about solar flares, if you could talk about the Discover satellite at all. I mean, and how long will that satellite be up there at L1, and should we replace it at some point? And also related to that is, you mentioned at the beginning X-rays from solar flares. So they go at the speed of light, so that's a little different, and whether Discover helps us at all with that.
So I don't actually know specifically about the Discover satellite. The solar missions that I generally follow are Solar Dynamics Observatory, which has a really awesome YouTube channel, by the way, and SOHO. So I can speak without knowing about its orbit. I can say that one of the threats to satellites in space from solar flares is that the heating from the flare can essentially puff up the Earth's atmosphere a little bit and create drag on satellites that essentially deorbits them over a period of time, not immediately. It's not going to rain satellites right away. So depending on the orbit that satellite is in, you could see it deorbit. It also, any kind of electronics in space that is vulnerable. There's some shielding, but not, not perfect shielding for electronics in space, and so that makes them vulnerable to flares. But in the case of X-rays, all light, visible light, X-rays, ultraviolet light, it all travels at the same speed. And so we do get that warning from the flare, the actual radiation that happens, that we might get the particle hits that create those aurorae and create a lot of the other deleterious effects here on Earth.
Yes, ma'am. Wait for the mic.
Thanks a lot for your insights. It's been really interesting. I guess what we're saying is, and it sounds like it's a premise of your work, is that the internet is now an integral part of human life, that if we lost it, we would have to restore it, which is an interesting assumption given that we didn't even have the internet, within my lifetime. So did you ever consider taking it in that direction versus how do we restore it?
Yeah, I mean, I allude to that. Thank you for the question. I allude to that in a little bit of what would happen in the US and how people would communicate. So there's actually a lot of really amazing thought about how people could communicate, actually using internet technology and ideas of sending packets across a network with pre-internet tools like ham radio. In the Houston, the hurricane, when Harvey hit, ham radio was really important for rescues, but not using the data side of it. It was just traditional use of ham radio. But there are different technologies. Some people call them sneaker nets. Some people call them mesh technologies, which don't depend on the internet to thrive. And there's a whole ecosystem developing. It's mostly people just tinkering right now. Some of them for military have some support for that. But I think probably you would get a blend. There's been enough advances in those kind of pre-internet, adapting pre-internet or working with simpler technologies. Because the internet, what's great about it is how distributed it is. You can get information in different ways to someone. Not everyone has to have every piece of the information or be the source of the information. And that's what's exciting. So there's no reason to get rid of that idea. We can keep that idea, but we just might have to adapt it to earlier technologies or analog technologies.
I would take that a little bit farther,
Yep.
back a little farther.
Yeah.
in the form of a question.
that we wouldn't necessarily recreate this broad network, that we would actually retract into smaller, more autonomous community sizes. In other words, you wouldn't have to have communication to California. You would stay within a region. So
You should
just
read his
that
book.
thought.
And that's a perfect closer. You should, after you buy the book, right over there, you should read the book. It's quite good. But join me in thanking our guests tonight. And once you have bought the book, Deji would be happy to sign it for you. So, and goodbye, internet. Not literally. I hope I hope the internet stays. I hope it doesn't go down. Good night.